Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kathy San Gabriel, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. And I'd like to welcome everybody to another roundtable discussion organized by Greenpeace. And today, we will be discussing, or we will gather various sectors of society in identifying the problems, needs, and solutions for us to be able to realize a post-quarantine better normal. This time, we will be tackling justice, not just Tiis, building an inclusive, secure, peaceful, and just better normal. But before we start our discussion, here are a couple of reminders for everybody. First, this event is being recorded and is airing live on social media. When not speaking, please be on mute to avoid audio issues. As we need to manage our time, a bell will ring if the allotted time for a speaking portion is down to 1 minute, and another bell to remind that the minute is already up. Kindly turn your videos on when speaking and use the built-in Q&A feature if you have questions. For those who are tuned in on Facebook, please use the comment section for your questions. And lastly, the views and opinions expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect those of the organizers and the organizations that they represent. And to tell us more about the importance of peace and justice in building a better post-pandemic scenario and why this is relevant to society in general and to environmental defenders in particular, we will welcome the former Climate Change Commission Commissioner of the Philippines and now the Executive Director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia. Let us say welcome and hello to Mr. Naderev Yeb Sanyo for his opening remarks. Yeb.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and for that very gracious introduction. And I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon. Greetings of peace to all of you. It's always an honor for me to be joining friends and fellow believers in a better normal. And we have a store of amazing people who are joining us today, and I hope that everyone who's tuning in stays with us for the entire RTT. So we now live truly in a world that has become dramatically different from the world when we were celebrating Christmas at the end of last year. Well, even very different from maybe 3 months ago. And we know that a lot of things have changed in very drastic ways because of the pandemic. But we need to be reminded that we do live in the same world where the climate crisis continues to affect lives and livelihoods, real people. We live in the same world where social and economic injustice persists and have not really gone away. And we're living in the same world order, or what we might refer to as the old normal, that has betrayed us time and again, including bringing us into an era of a climate emergency and also now this global health emergency. And we see so much disruption brought to us by the COVID-19 pandemic. And now, and despite the fact that our society is allegedly more connected than ever, it leads us to challenge our present and think about our future differently. Now we must put all of our energy behind trying to make this disruption, because we all agree that this has disrupted our lives in unprecedented ways. So we must do everything we can, put all of our creativity behind making this disruption work for changing our society as we have known it. Our society as we have known it is individualistic, competitive, unequal, destroys nature, profit-driven, towards one that could serve us better, one that we truly need, a society that is open, fraternal, where there is equality among us, peaceful, green, sustainable and in harmony with nature and with the public good as the driving force rather than profit. I know that that is a dream for many of us, and it looks far. But the moments where things can pivot are truly moments where things are very disruptive. Know that many of the most brilliant ideas were born during times of crisis. But what we also see as a context that right now it can go either way. We can go back to the old normal, or even worse, we can go to a future where that old normal is even aggravated or exacerbated. Because now we see that this situation we are all in could easily be the perfect condition for example, authoritarian governments and the elites, economic elites, to implement political and economic agenda that would deepen inequality, enrich further the 1%, as we call it in the social movements, or widen the gap between the rich and the poor and undercut all of us. It is also a moment where our disorientation, people could not even find public transport. People are going hungry. And this could be exploited, and we could be manipulated into just obeying and suspending our notion of a free and democratic society, and therefore other things like pushing radical free market policies and self-perpetuating political agendas at the expense of the many and the poor. And in moments of crisis, we all also know that people tend to focus on our day-to-day survival. And we do place our trust to those who are supposed to be doing their jobs. And that is a dangerous, dangerous situation. So what can we do to prevent all of this disruptive moment from spiraling into a future that would be more detrimental to us? This crisis actually offered us a pause from infinite growth. Maybe not the kind of pause that's necessary to reverse, for example, the climate crisis or poverty, but it did offer us an insight and a portal, if you may, as described by Arundhati Roy. And we can make this crisis catalyze an evolutionary leap, and take it as an opportunity to address the root causes of injustice, of the biggest problems that we confront right now. And it could be our one-time, big-time opportunity, and therefore one that we should never, ever waste. What does this mean for many of us? While the response to the pandemic shows an unprecedented alacrity or seriousness, maybe from all sectors, the government included, the response to this pandemic by many governments, maybe save except for governments led by women heads of state, the response we've seen is no model for the way we must govern in the future, and it's not a model for future international cooperation. What does this tell us? Will we be able to look into the eyes of our children and confess that we had the opportunity, but we lacked the courage, that we had the solutions, but we could not embrace the vision? My dear friends, as we go into this roundtable discussion, where we anticipate all of these wonderful ideas being put forward, I wish to emphasize that people power, compassion, and building our community are the keys to containing not just the coronavirus, but they are the model for future leadership and for confronting all of our biggest problems. So governments should not be, for example, offering no strings attached bailouts from the public purse at the expense of our public health. And the pandemic, I believe, represents a reckoning. It is a reckoning, a representation of how the system has failed us. And we can change the way that history is being written. And in the face of such an unprecedented situation in our history, the creativity of our response must match the unique nature of this crisis. And the magnitude of that response must match its scale, the scale of that crisis. And we must remember no country will be able to exit this crisis alone. Entire societies must come together. Every nation must step up, and collaboration must happen across all sectors with public, private, and civic sectors. And left on their own, even the best national level actions will not match the global scale and complexity of what we're going through. And this test demands more than ever a concerted, highly coordinated, and the most out-of-the-box ideas and actions from perhaps the world's richest economies and maximum financial and technical support for the poorest and most vulnerable communities. When I say all of these words, it seems like I'm talking about the coronavirus, but I'm talking about the climate crisis. So we must strive for a truly better normal where we put people at the center and where peace and justice are not academic topics, but real values that our society nurtures, protects, and upholds. And as I say all of this, it's truly amazing how when we talk about the coronavirus crisis, the same crucial solutions are almost the same we need to solve poverty, to achieve lasting peace, to confront social and economic injustice, and to avert the climate emergency. And in the specter of this crisis, what we do anticipate and can anticipate in the coming weeks could be a diverse range of issues, conversations, challenges, difficulties. And so we must remain thoughtful of the imbalance and inequity with which this crisis has affected many people and communities, and remind ourselves that not everyone could have afforded to remain at home or practice social distancing or eat decent meals every day. Finally, I'd like to stress that we are at war, and I don't like the war metaphor. That's such a patriarchal metaphor. But we are at war not with COVID-19, but with ourselves. And this is a crisis that is seriously challenging our humanity, our ability to care for others, our ability to express affection and solidarity with each other, our ability to think of others instead of our own interests, our humor and laughter, our connectedness, our very way of life. And in all of these, those who are at the margins of society, the poor, the neglected, they are bearing the largest share of suffering. As we all embark on this dream of a better normal, my dear friends, and strive to make it become closer to reality, we must become antibodies of justice and antibodies for solidarity. And we will find that agency together. Thank you very much. And I look forward to a wonderful discussion around why we all must look forward to a better normal and hear the ideas from our panelists on what it takes to build that future we all deserve and we all care about. Thank you very much and good afternoon. Back to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Yeb. And gaya nga ng nasabi po niya, para po dun sa ating mga manonood sa ating Facebook Live at Zoom, to summarize what Yeb said, no, nasa punto tayo ngayon kung saan yung krisis na ating dinadanas ay maaari nating gamitin para mapabuti yung ating hinaharap. Kaya yun yung tinatawag nating better normal at yun ang pag-uusapan natin ngayong hapon. At I just like to remind again our panelists, we need to manage our time. So a bell will ring if the allotted time for speaking portion is down to 1 minute, and another bell to remind that the minute is already up. Meantime, for our first presentation, we will hear about the current political and development landscape in the context of peace and justice, and including what inclusivity, security, and justice and peace mean in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and our recovery towards a better normal. We have with us an educator, political professional, and columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. He is an educator for more than 4 decades now, currently teaching at the Ateneo de Manila University and a former full professor for 25 years at the University of the Philippines. He also currently heads the Universities and Research Council's Network on Innovation for Inclusive Development in Southeast Asia. He is an authority with published works in the areas of Philippine government, political parties, project management, campaign finance reform, social accountability, and community service. Let us all welcome Dr. Segundo Joaquin Doy Romero. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Title of my brave piece today is The Philippines, the Road to the Best New Normal. The Philippine political system has been severely challenged by COVID-19 pandemic in several ways. First, President Duterte belittled the COVID-19 threat at the start. This is the mother of all the challenges. The president's attitude was communicated to government and the people. He was also visibly reluctant to stem the hordes of Chinese tourists on New Year's holiday, fanning out across the archipelago. Second, the bureaucracy has been in a command-style straitjacket. A plurality, about 1/3 of the cabinet officials of the Duterte administration come only from one of several bureaus of the government, and that bureau is the Armed Forces of the Philippines. Third, no strategic and coherent presidential leadership and cabinet teamwork has been evident from the midnight briefings we've seen. The resignation of Secretary Ernesto Pernia indicates technical expertise have been squeezed out of the decision-making process. Fourth, key players have been unnecessarily demonized or shunted aside. These include local governments like Marikina and Pasig, major media establishments like Abs-Cbn, and even the Office of the Vice President. The main failure that was the new normal collective behavior of the people was that it was externally imposed, using military means without regard to designing quarantine and checkpoint systems that work for the people. Fifth, there is no authoritative estimate of where we stand, the problem and the solution. We do not know exactly where we are in responding COVID-19. There are logistical, methodological problems in the COVID-19 statistics reported. These are not insurmountable problems, but the DOH has been found wanting not only in dealing with COVID-19, but in reporting on the status of the government actions as well. Sixth, the Bayanihan Hilas 1 Act was unsystematically implemented. The base information on the qualified and needy individuals was not accurate and adequate. The procedures for access were cumbersome. In the end, many needy Filipinos have fallen between the cracks of the system. Seventh, the OFWs and locally stranded individuals are showing just how challenged critically the government has become. The repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Filipino OFWs is a most critical challenge. It has consular, logistical, health, and security requirements that are difficult to untangle. They threaten to bankrupt the OWA funds as well as tie up the local quarantine resources. Eighth, the no vaccine, no school policy is poorly formulated and articulated. It is the most important long-term issue that must be resolved. The decision to use blended learning must be unpacked for specific localities across the archipelago and relevant specific actions taken. Now, let me go to the dimensions of political performance. The challenges that I have mentioned are called decisional efficacy challenges. They are about decision making. Now, let us borrow the language of the American political scientist Harry Eckstein, who suggests there are 4 dimensions of political performance. He says that the performance of a regime depends on its persistence over time, durability. The durability of a regime, in turn, depends on the absence of unregulated resorts to violence or civil order. Civil order, in turn, depends on the sense of the people that the government ought to be obeyed. That is legitimacy. Legitimacy depends On the other hand, on the extent to which the government makes prompt and relevant decisions for the well-being of the people, decisional efficacy. So we can see that one can ensure the durability of a regime by sheer resort to military forces. One can postpone the use of military forces if you can use propaganda like fake news to make the people believe a leader is the long-awaited savior. But in the end, it is only decisional efficacy that is the most stable and reliable source of political performance. So where are we? Now, let me sketch to us a road to the new normal. There are 4 scenarios: the best new normal scenario, the tolerable new normal scenario, the restive new normal scenario, and the dismal new normal scenario. Okay, so let's advance to the next slide. So you can see here the relationship of the dimensions. Now let's look at the next slide. Okay, so we have here a table, and you can see that the on the column headings, you have capacity of Duterte government to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. And it has 2 values: loss of control, meaning not massive outbreak, and on the other hand, effective control well within health system capacity. We do not know what that will be in the next year or so. On the other side, on the row side, we have capacity of local governments and families, communities and families using self-help and mutual help to provide for their basic needs, long-term survival capacity. And you have high capacity and low capacity. Okay, the best situation is there is effective control by government of COVID, and that local communities have high capacity in helping themselves. That is our best new normal. Satisfactory levels of decisional efficacy. There is legitimacy, meaning government is not beleaguered by the people. There is civil order, and there is no need for military social control nor use of anti-terror laws. The next one is effective control by government, but no capacity on the local communities to help themselves. We will have health-focused decisional efficacy. There will be increased demand on government to provide social amelioration, and there will be increased resort to military social control because people will be hungry and they will be out of jobs. We have the tolerable new normal. Here you have loss of control by government. However, the people are taking care of themselves through self-help and mutual help. There is no decisional efficacy. There is increased deaths and sickness, but people, there is increased community and household actions against COVID-19. There are lower government resources for non-COVID-19 problems, and there is increased resort to military social control. And the last one is dismal new normal. This is dismal because there is loss of control over the outbreak, and the people do not have the capacity or inclination to help themselves. No decisional efficacy, tenuous civil order. There will be sporadic to frequent acts of protest, anarchy, and defiance. Military rule and full use of anti-terror law is likely. Poor peace, security, justice experience of the people, and perhaps a pressure for regime change. So these are the 4 new normals we have. And what is our best normal? How can we reach the best normal? That is our next slide. And here we're saying these are the things we need to do. Increase decisional efficacy by a radical change in cabinet to bring in new talent and expertise immediately. Duterte must change his cabinet drastically if we want a change in the way things are going. Next. The president must shift to a facilitator mode. He should not be a health expert all unto his own. Allow the bureaucracy to maximize its expertise and talent by providing the president with completed staff work. Next. perform a full and up-to-date diagnosis and understanding of the problem and gaps across the nation. If we don't know the problem, we cannot solve it. We need a clear diagnosis. Next. We need to focus on empowering local governments and communities to police their ranks, take care of face masks and social distancing. That should not be left to government alone, and set up social safety nets. Then we need to decide to learn and shift to the strategic pathway that works, as exemplified by the proactive, comprehensive, responsive, and efficacious programmatic actions taken by the Office of the Vice President. So those are the things that will lead us to the best new normal. And these are our scenarios. Hopefully, they will trigger us to action. As Yab Sano says, we are at war with ourselves. We have to change our own behavior. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Doy Romero, for that presentation. At just to recap a bit, kanina po ay pinakita niya yung mga scenarios kung saan maaari nasaan ang Pilipinas sa ngayon sa handling ng pamahalaan nitong COVID crisis. At nagbigay din si Dr. Romero ng kanyang mga rekomendasyon kung papaano maaaring tugunan ng pamahalaan ang mga suliranin o na kinakaharap nito sa ngayon para ma-attain natin yung tinatawag na better or best normal. Samantala, for the second part of our program, we will be hearing about the current situation on the ground with regard to human rights concerns in the context of the administration's more militarized response or measures in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our presenter is Ms. Rosemary Trajano. She is a licensed nurse, development worker, and human rights defender. She was previously the executive director of the Medical Action Group and Kanlungan Center founder, as well as former national project manager of Plan International Philippines. She is currently the Secretary General of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates and convener of In Defense of Human Rights and Dignity movement. She is also a two-term vice president of the International Federation of Human Rights and a member of the General Assembly of World Organization Against Torture and alternate member of the Executive Council of Forum Asia. Following Ms. Trajano's presentation will be a reaction from attorney Algamar Latip, a peace advocate and moral human rights lawyer. He was former chairperson of the Regional Human Rights Commission of ARMM, which we now know as BARMM, and later on its legal consultant. Chevening Fellow at the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom in 2007. He also attended Conflict, Human Rights, and Transnational Justice at Geneva Academy of International Human Rights in 2014 and International Criminal Law at Leiden University at the same year. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Ms. Trajano, to be followed by Attorney Latip.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat, doon sa mga panelists. Nice to see familiar faces kahit we're afar. Alam natin we're still working on the same advocacies, no? And also to our viewers sa ating mga social media accounts. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on human rights and what's happening on the ground. And I'm sure all of us knew what is really happening, no? And many of what I might be saying was already mentioned by Sir Doy. No? Salamat po for providing the political context. We believe that human rights is also political, no? But human rights encompasses all aspects of our lives. No? Mula po pagdilat ng mata hanggang sa pagpikit natin sa gabi. Let me share with you what I have with my slides. I do not know how to finish in 5 minutes yung 100 slides I prepared. because of the more thousands violations that have happened during this COVID experience we have. So, sa pagtingin po ng human rights community, we call it actually a DOM approach, no? Not dirty old man, but more on dole out and militarist. No? We say militarist because we think our administration have this penchant for war. Kaya palaging militarist ang approach, no? We have the war on drugs, we have the war on terror, and now we have a war on COVID. Parang mga combatants ang COVID. Parang nakikita natin. Kaya dapat militarist din ang approach, no? However, ang nakakalungkot po ay napaka-dole out noong ginawang approach, no? Walang participation, walang meaningful participation ang mga civil society organizations, ang mga communities, ang mga tao, no? As mentioned earlier, kung ano lang yung inilagay sa batas at kung ano lang yung gusto nilang gawin, yun ang nasunod without really consulting those people who are impacted and those sectors who can actually help out, no, in combating this pandemic. So the OM approach includes maraming mga threats, harassments, labeling of individuals and human rights groups, no, who question, criticize government policies and actions. Marami pong mga nahuli. Okay? Next slide, please. Okay. The granting of the special power to the Philippine President with the passage of the Bayanihan Act. Okay. At yung pag-i-install ng mga military, mga retired generals, almost all who are top henchmen in policy making and implementer ng ating COVID approach ay mga general, mga militar. No? Naalala ko yung press con, the first na press conference na ginawa nila, nandun lahat ng cabinet secretaries, pero at the back of the president, militar at police ang nasa likod. Hindi nakaligtas yung pandemic doon sa kill policies ng government, no? At may order to shoot to kill those violating the enhanced community quarantine. At ito po ay malinaw na sinabi niya sa isang press conference the day after yung mga urban poor ng Barangay San Roque ay napilitan talagang lumabas dahil wala silang natatanggap na ayuda at nagugutom na sila. As I mentioned, yung dole-out approach, no? Treatment of people and communities as passive recipients and beneficiaries. Samantalang napakaraming pamamaraan, alam natin na napaka-dynamic ng ating mga POs, ng ating mga communities, and they can help out in combating this pandemic. Okay, some of the human rights violations we have documented, or next slide please. Yeah. Nakita niyo po siguro yung isang barangay captain sa Laguna, no, who locked up curfew violators in dog cages. Ito ay mga kabataan. Next slide. Maraming mga special treatment sa mga politician and government officials in the testings of COVID-19. Very recently lang tumataas yung testing na ginagawa. Pero sabi ng ilan po nating mga government hospitals, continuous pa rin, no, yung mga VIP treatment. Pagka ikaw ay kilala, kapag ikaw ay may pera, madali kang magpa-test. Pero yung ating mga manggagawa, no, na sinusuong yung buhay nila araw-araw sa kalsada, ay walang testing. Okay? Nakakalungkot, no? It's not only the president who are saying negative things, no, about human rights, but also, of course, many top-ranking officials. There are no human rights under state of emergency. There's no writ of habeas corpus. Nakakatakot po ito at mga nangyari. Ang panawagan noon ay mass testing, hindi mass arrest. No? Pero mas mataas po yung mga naging aresto kesa dun sa mga test. Yung San Roque 21 spends weekend in jail. We also heard of Piston 6, no, mga matatandang mga driver na nakakulong. At 2 sa kanila ngayon ay positive na for COVID. No? These are some of the human rights violations we documented. Of course, unfortunately, we were all locked up, we were all quarantined, at hindi namin direktang mapuntahan itong mga tao na ito, no, to document their cases. But we gathered cases from social media, from news articles, at merong mga direct reports po sa PARA. At ang pinakamataas, no, na mga violations include arbitrary arrest and detention, harassments, extrajudicial killings. Imagine, we have 15 extrajudicial killings happen during the time of this pandemic. Napakarami din po yung mga inhumane and degrading treatment, which is actually included as a form of torture sa ating anti-torture law. And we also have cases actually of torture, discrimination, forced eviction, and forced disappearances. Next slide, please. Okay. Very recently po, ang PARA, no, April 30 lang, nakasama kami again as a terrorist, pero ngayon, dagdag na virus na. No? The 303 AFP Infantry Brigade posted in their Facebook last April 30 na yung mga CPP, NPA, NDF virus terrorists should be avoided like COVID-19. No? At kasama po ang PARA at ang Medical Action Group dito sa poster na ito. And the most frightful siguro, no, at this time, in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of all the heartaches, the insufficiency of response, meron ng soon to be enacted Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. And we are expecting more violations among human rights defenders, among development workers, or even among common people. Katulad ng naging resulta po ng Article 6, Section F ng Bayanihan Act, no? At least 2 teachers ang nahuli dahil nagpo-post lang sila ng sama ng loob. At ang isa pa, were actually charged with inciting to sedition. Fortunately, dinismiss ang kaso niya. But with this Anti-Terrorism Act at yung pa ring regulations, no, as repressive regulations under COVID, and of course yung Executive Order number 70, the National Task Force to End Local Communists, we are into graver human rights situation in the Philippines. Salamat po. Yun na lang muna po. Siguro ang dagdag ko lang doon, although mas nag-focus kami doon sa usapin ng civil and political rights, ang human rights po ay kumpleto, economic, social, and cultural rights, and many of the participants will be discussing it also. Salamat po.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Rosemary Trajano, talking about the human rights issues that we are facing right now amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, we would like to turn you over to Attorney Latip. He was the former chairman of the ARMM Human Rights Commission. Good afternoon, sir. Sir?
Yes, good afternoon po.
Yes, sir. You may begin your presentation.
Okay, magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. In order for us to understand the current military responses in the Bangsamoro, we have to restart to the context that we have, because we have a very unique context. So during the pre-Philippine Republic, 429 years ago, or in 1591, the first military action was resorted to against Moro during the Spanish colonial expansion. And it lasted for 307 years. And then in 1902, for over 11 years, we have the Moro-US War that claimed nearly 10% of the Moro population. And then during the US Commonwealth, Moro were excluded in the nation building and the state building. In terms of identity, they are excluded. In the bureaucracy, Moro had no participation whatsoever. They were also excluded in the development policy. There were mass land grabbing through legislation. Moro were uprooted from their ancestral land permanently. So from 80% population of Moro in Mindanao in 1902, it was reduced only to 20% in 2002, 100 years thereafter. In economic development, Moro was so marginalized that it led to deprivation, to basic needs and survival. That is the reason that when the Philippines attained its independence in 1946, just 2 years thereafter, the Philippines as a body politic created and produced Haji Camblon in 1948, who declared war against the Philippine government and attacked a military camp. The Philippines resorted to military option that lasted for 7 years. In this military response had set the tone for the Philippine government as a policy that continued up to this present. Camblon was convicted, and then Miswari is one of those who advocated for his pardon. And then less than a decade later, Miswari would lead MNLF against the government, which involved 75% of the strength of the Philippine military. It was deployed in Mindanao. And then in 1990s, after the end of Cold War, violent extremism group was born in the region. And since then, we have these Abu Sayyaf, Khalifa, Mauti Group, and others. The region also hosts so many private armed groups, and it has the highest density of loose firearms in the country. And we also have Rido or family feud that led to armed conflict among the family. This persisted. So what is the present context of the Bangsamoro? If you see the next slide, I provided 2 slides, another picture. Slide number 4, paki-transport po sa slide number 4. Next slide, please. So this is the Budaho in 1906. And the next slide is the next slide, please. That is the cost of war from 1970 to 1996. And the next slide is more contemporary, more recent, which is the 2015 IDP due to armed conflict. So you can see the density of conflict in our region. So this is military response and the span for 400 years, more than 429 years, still ongoing actually. And we have this AFD versus BIFF. There is IDP versus Armed Forces of the Philippines, and also family feud. So this is the context of the Bangsamoro. We have in terms of poverty and inequality, the Bangsamoro is the poorest in the country with highest incidence of inequalities, making the people limited in choices and lesser control over their environment. In terms of armed conflict, despite of the peace process and peace agreement with MNLF and MILF, we produced just this January to May 2019. There's already a Bangsamoro organic law at that time. There were 444,000 IDPs, and there were 70 municipality armed conflict. So we have also a culture of impunity because of the culture of silence. Hindi po natin masisisi yung mga kababayan namin kung di mag-report sa police, militar at saka law enforcement kung sila ay magiging biktima ng retaliation at saka reprisals. In terms of democratic deficit, our region is characterized by lack of transparency, lack of accountability, inadequate citizen participation in the decision making. In the region electoral process, it is the fraud, vote buying, and use of force. And we have high density of political dynasty. Plus, the justice mechanism is so weak. So we have the courts, we have the LGUs, we have the mechanism, accountability created by law there, but it's not functioning properly. So our basic institution break down. So for the government, instead of strengthening and making the institution work, the response of the government again is its coercive power of military. So hindi nasosolve yung problem because this military problem started 429 years ago at hanggang ngayon ay hindi pa siya naging solusyon sa problema ng Moro. So this makes the people at risk, vulnerable, more vulnerable, and prone to human rights violation. So yung iba, nag-resort na sila ng violent extremism. This 2007, nagkaroon ng Marawi siege, and the place where I was born, Marawi City, was destroyed. But despite of the destruction of Marawi City, the Mauti group, the extremist group is still there. Hindi na solved. So maraming namatay, maraming na-displaced. And actually, this anti-terror bill was a commitment from the part of the legislator na hindi na muling mag-declare ngayong 2020 na martial law because it was declared for more than 1 year. So ipinasa nga itong anti-terror bill. So this is new, not new actually, whether or not we have anti-terror bill or not. The Moros still suffer, na napakalaki na sa suffer niya. You can actually, the evidence is pumunta ka sa BGMP, sa SICA, na mayroong mga iba't ibang nakakulong doon from all over Bangsamoro, no? Na galing doon, na iba't ibang kaso. So yan yung manifestation na hindi talaga siya nakakasolve. So ano yung mga surfacing gaps and possible solutions? First thing is that nation building aspect, the inclusivity of narrative. The symbol of our nation systematically excluded Moro. So look at the Pambansang Awit. We are not included there. Look at the Watawat ng Pilipinas. Hindi kami kasama sa history. So nagkakaroon talaga ng exclusion yung Moro. Kaya what policy making na legislator o kahit na mga sino magawa ng policy, they do not have sympathy towards a Moro. Ang unang-unang resort ay military option. So if we have this, bakit hindi sinasama yung kabayanihan ng Moro they fought for freedom for more than 3 centuries against a Spanish colony. This is not even recognized. We have this Independence Day this month, but it was not included in the narrative. But we fought the longest. And the Spaniards, the superpower at the time, we defeated them. But that patriotism that we exhibit to fight for our freedom is not recognized in our history book. And then we have, what are the manifestations? We have Moro ghettos sa mga communities dito sa malalaking lugar. Cebu City, Metro Manila, because we are rejected by the society. So we created our community. So these are the effects. Up to now, the anti-discrimination bill is still pending in the Senate at hindi pa siya nagsasabatas. So yung social contract and the Constitution, this with respect to the anti-terror bill, we surrender theoretically our rights and freedom to the government. This is to a form of the Constitution. Then we have the government. The governments in return should protect our rights. Kung makikita po natin yung Constitution, the reason on why we created in the principles, the unang provision is the prime duty of the government is to serve and protect the people. Yan po ang kanyang duty. Pangalawa, the armed forces was created. This is the wording of the Constitution, and I quote, the armed forces of the Philippines is the protector of the people. Nandun pa rin sa principle ng Constitution natin, sa pinakauna. Peace in order is for the protection of life, liberty, and property, which are essential for the enjoyment of all people. So when you do policy making, like for instance, the legislator, this must be observed. Protection of the people, protection of freedom, protection of liberty. That is the reason why we created the government. So this must be approved. We have to reevaluate ourselves as a nation. And then we have the transitional justice mechanism, which is the institutionalization, transitional justice mechanism can function as an effective facilitator of post-conflict reconciliation and stabilization of the region. So definitely, hindi dito kasama yung militarization and military response. Kasi we know that more than 400 years, hindi nag-work sa Moro yung military solution.
All
And
right.
then,
Dr.
okay.
Latif, I'm
Yes.
sorry to inform you that the time is up, but we will have a question and answer portion right after our discussion. So thank you so much for giving us an insight on the historical and current context of the Bangsamoro. Napaka-masalimuot po nitong usaping ito at maraming salamat po sa inyo, Attorney Latif, sa pagbibigay linaw sa maikling panahon na ito, yung konteksto ng struggle ng Bangsamoro people. Samantala po ay we would just like to remind everybody to just, if you have questions, yung mga nanonood po sa amin sa Facebook or sa Zoom, maaari nyo pong i-type ang inyong questions at sasagutin po ito ng ating mga speaker mamaya. At samantala ay i-introduce na natin ang ating mga susunod na speaker at yung next part ng ating discussion ay magfo-focus po sa labor and gender issues sa konteksto ng COVID-19 response at anong kailangan gawin dito sa mga areas na ito para magtungo po ang ating lipunan sa tinatawag nating better normal. Presenting will be Mr. Joshua Mata, who has been a trade unionist for more than 30 years. He is currently serving as the Secretary General of the 100,000-strong sentro ng mga nagkakaisa at progresibong manggagawa. Mr. Mata is currently sitting in the Board of Trustees of the Labor Education and Research Network, a workers' education association established by the trade unions in the Philippines. As reactor to the presentation, we will have Attorney Virginia Suarez, who is currently a co-convener of Scrap VFA Movement, a broad campaign network of coalitions, organizations, and individuals who have united in pursuit of genuine sovereignty. Attorney Suarez is a labor rights lawyer and is the chairperson of the Filipino women's rights group Kababaihan para sa Kalayaan, as well as Secretary General of political organization Kilusan, or Movement for National Democracy. Attorney Suarez is dedicated to helping underserved communities, and many of her legal clients are workers, farmers, fisher folk, and urban poor for whom she works pro bono. She defended and won the Jennifer Laude case, the trans woman killed by a U.S. soldier. So let us welcome Mr. Mata, to be followed by Attorney Suarez. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Joshua Mata.
Good afternoon, Cathy, at magandang hapon ho sa inyong lahat. No? Dito sa panel at sa mga nanonood po sa atin at nakikinig sa atin. Indeed, we need a better normal. No? Kami po mga manggagawa, ayaw na namin bumalik dun sa normal. No? Kasi hindi ho makatarungan yung normal. Ang better normal para sa amin ay isang daigdig na kung saan ang mga manggagawa ay hindi na kailangan mag-worry pa tungkol sa kanyang mga basic needs, sa kanyang pagkain, sa kanyang shelter, clothing, health, education, and leisure. Sa isang daigdig na kung saan mayroon tayong kapayapaan at mayroong pagkakapantay-pantay na nakabatay sa hustisya, no? Na kung saan ang ating buhay ay hindi na nag-undermine nung mismong daigdig na tinitirahan natin. No? Yan po yung better normal na hinahanap namin. At ayaw namin, as I said, ayaw namin ng normal. Kasi yung normal po, broken ho yun in the first place. No? Ang economy noon hindi resilient. Marami sa mga mamamayan natin noon walang trabaho. Yung mga may trabaho, underemployed, precarious, exposed to dirty, demeaning, and dangerous types ng mga trabaho. Tapos, mahirap talaga ang buhay no nung panahon na yon, no, lalo na para sa mga manggagawa, no. It was hard, it was brutish if you like. Walang public transportation no, na masama na yung public transportation noon. 4 na oras kami naghihintay, nagbabiyahe every day. 1 oras naghihintay para makasakay, no. Public services were wanting, many like yung kunyari public health natin, highly privatized yan, no. Walang mga bahay ang mga tao, yung mga may bahay walang access sa tubig, walang access sa kuryente. Tapos wala ring internet connection ang karamihan. No, indeed, hindi resilient economy natin, and that's the reason why hindi katakataka na it only took 100 days for this pandemic to unravel years of economic growth that the government loves to extol. Politically, hindi na namin gusto yung normal kasi yung normal politically, powerless kami. No? Marami sa mga manggagawa at yung mga union ay na-undermine ng repressive na trade labor regimes. No? Na kung saan, baka hindi alam na marami dito, no? Mula po nung umupo ang administrasyon ng Duterte, 45 na manggagawa na po at saka mga pesante ang pinaslang dahil lamang sila ay nag-assert ng kanilang karapatan para mag-union. 45, no, as of last year. Ibang usapin pa yung yung patuloy na pinaslang sa taong ito na binanggit ni kasamang Rose kanina, no? Now, totoo na lahat tayo ay naapektuhan ng pandemic, no? Subalit nakita rin natin, no, na hindi lahat tayo ay nandun sa parehong crisis. No, not all of us are in the same crisis. In fact, the pandemic revealed that napakaraming mga Pilipinas pala dito sa ating bansa. We saw yung penthouse Philippines na kung saan yung mga mayayaman at makapangyarihan ay nag-enjoy ng VIP treatment, no, habang nakakapag-hoard sila ng pagkain ensconced in their comfortable houses, no. Yan yung VIP, yan yung penthouse Philippines. Meron yung ground floor Philippines. Marami dyan yung mga middle class, no, na kaya lang mag-survive, no, pero marami rin sa kanila ay kinakapos. Subalit very concerned sila sa nangyayaring mga atrocities sa paligid nila. Pero ang karamihan sa mga miyembro namin ay makikita nyo sa basement Philippines. Yan po yung Pilipinas na kung saan pag wala kang trabaho, gutom mga abutin mo. At sila ay cramped sa mga depressed communities nila. Marami ang kanilang movement ay severely constrained ng mga militar, ng mga security forces. At pag nagutom sila at sumubok sila lumabas para manghingi ng pagkain, magprotesta even, abay kinukulong ho sila, katulad ng binanggit na rin ng ibang mga kasama natin kanina. No? During the pandemic, let me just explain that during the pandemic, everyone in the working class were badly affected ng problemang ito. No? Meron daw, iba-iba naman iba-iba ang epekto, pero lahat ay tinamaan. Meron those lucky enough na merong income, katulad ng public sector workers, habang may pandemic. Pero marami, lalo na yung mga nasa private sector, kahit na nagtatrabaho pa sa mga malalaking kumpanya, no work, no pay po yan. No? Tapos, ang tagal-tagal na panahon, wala pong ayuda na binigay sa kanila at yung umabot sa kanila, kapos na kapos. Yung mga frontline workers natin, talagang for many days, they were left to fend for themselves po. No? Many suffered from lack of public transportation. Some even suffered from lack of PPEs. At yung mga PPEs na pinrovide sa kanila nung simula ay naku po, substandard, which was the reason why hundreds of our public health workers ay talagang tinamaan ng both public and private health workers ay tinamaan ng sakit. No? Meanwhile, yung mga manggagawa na nag-push back, no, laban sa at sumubok na mag-assert ng safe working conditions, sila naman po ay tinira naman ng mga kumpanya. Halimbawa po sa Coca-Cola. No, yung tatlong manggagawa po namin na leader diyan sa Pampanga, tinanggal ho sila ng kumpanya at ang akusasyon sa kanila economic sabotage. Alam niyo po ang totoong ginagawa lang nila, nag-assert sila ng karapatan ng mga miyembro nila na magtrabaho sa na magkaroon ng safe working conditions. Ngayon, tinanggal sila, nagprotesta po yung mga miyembro namin. Alam niyo ang ginawa sa kanila? Nung nagprotesta sila, may mask sila, may physical distancing, lalabas lang sila ng placard sandali, pinag-aaresto po at dinetain ng isang araw, no, doon sa kulungan. No? Hindi nakatulong na mga policies ng Department of Labor ay nag-undermine din ng karapatan namin. No? At ito pa ngayon nagbigay ng daan para sa ibang kumpanya na i-roll back ang mga wages at saka mga wage benefits. Worse, nung nagsasuffer ng economy, the very same economy na sinabi ko kanina na broken, yung mga manggagawa ay hiningi nila na magtrabaho without being protected, without providing public health, without providing public transportation system. More importantly, walang paid quarantine leaves at walang guarantee pagka sa kanila sila ay nasaktan o nagkaroon ng sakit. Indeed, our government has mismanaged yung handling ng COVID-19. But now we see na mini-mismanage din niya ang handling do sa economic impact nitong pandemic na ito. 70% ng ating manggagawa, or around 20 million, are either unemployed, underemployed, o kaya ay may trabaho sila pero hindi makapagtrabaho. OFWs natin, about 500,000 to 1 million are expected to come back or mawalan ng trabaho. No? Yung PUJs po natin, hanggang ngayon, 50,000 to 70,000 units, which you multiply it by 2, for every unit, about 100,000 workers na mga jeepney drivers natin are now reduced to begging, and yet government is not giving them aid, and and government is not allowing them to travel. So these are the problems, no? And unfortunately, the government keeps downplaying, no, the impact of the world's worst crisis in 150 years. Now, what do we need? This is why we're calling for better normal. At para sa amin ang better normal ay ito yung pagkakataon natin na i-correct natin ang inequities at saka ang kamalian at saka yung kapalpakan na nakikita natin both sa economy natin at sa ating politika. That's why we are demanding na magkaroon tayo ng maayos na industrial policy that will make sure na maitatayo natin ang isang lipunan na lipunan na mas safe para sa atin, mas caring para sa atin, mas resilient, and more importantly, climate friendly. Nakikita namin ang dinidemand namin, panahon na para unahin natin ang pangangailangan ng mga mamayan natin kaysa profits ng mga korporasyon. Therefore, that means that we need to build up a robust public service system from health, education, no, transportation, and even energy, as well as for example digital infrastructure natin. These are public services that the government should look into. Lalong-lalo na pagdating sa energy. Kailangan natin ng energy democracy. Kailangan natin na mag-shift na talaga sa isang low carbon na energy system na kaya naman natin gawin, and there's already the technology that's available para sa ating lahat. Meanwhile, in terms of the economy, sa tingin namin, kailangan masiguro ngayon na yung panahon para pag-isipan natin na mag-provide ng guaranteed income para sa lahat ng mga taong walang trabaho o hindi pa makapagtrabaho. At more importantly, yung mawawalan ng trabaho talaga, panahon na para mag-introduce tayo ng guaranteed jobs o employment guarantees na katulad na nakita natin halimbawa sa India, sa Kerala, na namin ay magbibigay ng maayos na kinabukasan para sa lahat.
Mr. Mata, sorry to interrupt. You have 30 seconds to wrap up your presentation. Thank you.
I just wrapped up, Kathy. So I just said that those are some of the elements that we need. No, we need to make sure that workers this time in a better society are taken care of.
Thank you so much for your presentation on the current state of workers during this pandemic. Samantala po ay ang susunod naman natin ay si Attorney Suarez. Siya po ay magbibigay sa atin ng kanyang presentation tungkol pa rin sa labor and gender issues. Magandang hapon po sa inyo, Attorney Suarez. Attorney Suarez? All right.
Yes. Okay.
There you go. We can hear you now.
Yes. Sige. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Magandang hapon din sa lahat ng kasama natin na nandito sa Zoom na ito, sa webinar na ito. I completely agree with Joshua. No, when it comes to workers, sa mga binanggit niya, we need a new normal. And this time, it's a better normal. Dahil talaga namang prior to this COVID, napakasama naman talaga ng sitwasyon, no, ng mga manggagawa. Palagay ko, marami na siyang nasabi kaugnay ng mga manggagawa. Kaya I'd like to focus on the women and how the military's response of this government affect women. Actually, pag tinignan natin, this Duterte administration has from the very start used militarization, no, war and militarization. This administration captured the legislative, neutralized the judiciary, weaponized the law. And these are the very same formula for martial rule, for authoritarian rule. No? Parehong-pareho, walang pinagkaiba. At yan ay pinakita ng administrasyon nito sa simula pa lang kung saan ang kanyang mga cabinet members ay puro mga militar. No? Kaya markado ang administrasyon na ito sa matinding militarisasyon. Sinimulan niya sa kanyang giyera sa droga. At ang tindi rin ng atake, no? Kilala rin ng administrasyon nito sa matinding pag-atake sa mga kababaihan. Misogynist itong administrasyon na ito. Remarks that do not simply violate women. He even encourages, initiates, perpetuates violence and encourage the rape culture. Ang tindi ng diskriminasyon, ang tindi ng atake sa kababaihan. No? Ang tindi ng militarisasyon at alam natin, habang tumitindi ang militarisasyon, matindi ang epekto nito sa kababaihan. Pag tiningnan natin, sa simula pa lang siya, 2018, hindi ko alam yung datos ng 2017, 300 billion budget ang ibinigay niya sa militar. Kumpara natin ngayon sa COVID budget, 275 billion, mas mababa pa kumpara doon sa budget na militar na ibinigay niya noong 2018. No? Bukod pa dito, sa gitna, itong pandemic na to, Duterte further intensified the militarization. At ito ay pinakita niya rin kaagad dito sa IATF, kung saan ang lahat ng miyembro, karamihan ay mga militar. Excluded ang mga health sectors, scientists, virologists, etc. And especially excluded ang mga basic sectors, lalo na ang mga kababaihan. You know, when you exclude women especially, diba, you are actually excluding more than half of your population. Dahil ganun ang populasyon ng kababaihan. No? Sa gitna ng pandemic, ano ang ginawa ng administrasyon na ito? Diba, bumili ng 2 warships from Korea at pinagmamalaki yun ng Navy. Ano ang ginawa pa niya? $2 billion arms trading, 'di ba? O arms purchase doon sa US. At itong malaking budget na sinasabi natin, pero kumpara natin naman sa military budget na binigay niya noong 2018, sa military, walang audit, walang transparency. Kaya hindi natin nga alam kung talagang nakarating sa dapat patunguhan dahil alam natin napakaraming mga manggagawa na hindi nabigyan ng ayuda. Napakarami ang mga manggagawa na karamihan ay mga babae. Mga informal workers na karamihan ng mga babae. Mga nagtitinda sa palengke, mga nagtitinda sa street, karamihan ng mga babae na hindi nakatanggap ng ayuda. Saan napunta? Siyempre, kapag ang pinag-uusapan natin, itong militarisasyon na ito, huwag nating kalilimutan ang tinding epekto sa kababaihan. At ito, gusto ko na lang dito mag-focus dahil ang PNP, pinagmamalaki niya. Ano yung pinagmalaki niya? 8 women lang daw. Ang 8 women ang nare-rape araw-araw sa buong panahon ng pandemya. Ano to? March to April. Masaya na at pinagmamalaki ng PNP yon dahil daw mas mababa yon sa mga nakaraang taon. But let us scrutinize that, di ba? While PNP or military brags about the decline, sabi nila in gender-based violence reported to authorities, it could actually mean or point to a sad reality that is more worrisome. Ano yon? That women victims are simply unable to report abuse due to quarantine or due to lockdown measures. During the lockdown, ang maraming babae na lockdown din sa bahay kung saan ang tindi ng domestic violence. Tumindi ang domestic violence, bakit? Itong mismong administrasyon mismo, ang nangunguna sa pag-atake sa kababaihan. Nag-number 1 tayo pagdating sa cybersex, 'di ba? Sa child prostitution. Napakadami, 600,000 alone noong 2018 at tumaas yan during the pandemic period. Ang dami ng mga unreported rapes, ang dami ng mga physical violence na nangyari sa bahay, sa checkpoints, mga verbal abuses at huwag natin kalimutan yung reported sex trade. 'Di ba? Kung saan kapalit ng mga quarantine pass 150 pesos, o kaya kapalit ng quarantine pass, wala kang 150 pesos, 'di ba? Pakapa sa private parts ng babae o kaya sex ang hinihingi. Itong cyberbullying ang tindi during this pandemic. At diyan, walang sinisino, ordinaryong masa, kahit mga artista, kahit sino pa. Diyan talagang antindi ng cyberbullying kahit kay sa ating vice president o sa ating vice presidente, no? Mga ordinaryong tao, mga ordinaryong kababaihan, no? Merong isang kaming na document, 69-year-old na street dweller, no? Pinanahan ng 5,000. Yung babaeng nurse, no, dahil nakaangkas sa motor, na fine ng 5,000 pesos. yung writer na kung saan nag-report na contaminated ang sitio Zapatera sa Cebu. O, tinakot, nakakasuhan. In fact, inaresto. Merong isang babae na hinaras, no? Dahil doon sa may checkpoint, kinuha ang kanyang mga personal information at saka inabutan ng regalo. Ang sabi sa kanya, meron akong inipit dyan sa'yo, regalo ko yan sa'yo. Telephone number ng polis at pagkatapos ng tawag na tawag sa kanya. Meron din. At ito, yung rape of female detainees na nahuli kung saan, of course, yung dalawang pulis naman eventually ay na-aresto. Ito yung kalagayan ng kababaihan. Prior to this, di ba kanina nabanggit nga dun sa may Bangsamoro, the militarization has always been there. Hindi lang ngayon, pero tumindi during this pandemic. At sa gitna nitong pandemic na ito, sa halip na mass testing, no? Sa halip na tingnan paano susolusyonan ng problema, itong anti-terrorism bill. This anti-terrorism bill will further the militarization. Diba? Kaya no? I'd like to wrap up, no? Sige, thank you.
Yes,
ano ang
please,
dapat, no? Yes, ano ang dapat? With God budget, gamitin to para sa kalusugan, ano? To protect the women, to safeguard the women. Andyan yung God budget eh. Diba? Tiyakin ang vaccination ng mga kababaihan, meron namang God budget. Bakit hindi gamitin? Isama ang kababaihan sa data, sa analysis ng data, dahil kapag hindi mo ang sinama ang narratives, no, at ang data ng kababaihan, hindi mo rin kasama sa solusyon, hindi mo kasama sa programa, hindi mo kasama sa rehabilitasyon. Pag ganito ang nangyari, whatever solution, whatever rehabilitation is bound to fail. Maraming salamat. Maybe I'll add na lang later. Thank you, Cathy.
All right. Thank you so much, Attorney. And susunod po naman nating tatalakayin ay medyo controversial at hot topic ngayong lockdown. Ito po yung issue patungkol sa free speech at freedom of the press habang nasa lockdown. We have Ms. Florine Simon. She is the Officer in Charge and Training Director of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, or PCIJ. She leads the PCIJ's training program and develops training modules for journalists, civil society organizations, government agencies, and members of the academe. She also takes part in producing investigative reports. PCIJ, which was founded in 1989, is an independent nonprofit media agency that specializes in investigative reporting. She will be followed by Attorney Emilio Marañon III as a reactor. Attorney Marañon is an election and human rights lawyer, as well as a political analyst. He is also a columnist at Rappler, Senior Legal Officer of Lentis Human Rights Desk, and also a research fellow at the Ateneo School of Government, working on BARMM's electoral policy issues. He completed his Master's of Law degree as a Chevening Scholar at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, specializing on human rights, conflicts, and transitional justice. Let us all welcome Ms. Simon, to be followed by Attorney Marañon. Good afternoon, Ms. Simon.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Thank you, Cathy. Una po ay ang aming pagpapasalamat din sa Greenpeace sa pagkakataong makibahagi sa talakayan ngayong hapon. I was tasked to talk about free speech and press freedom in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Nais ko pong magsimula sa konteksto na ang malayang pamamahayag at malayang pagpapahayag ay mga karapatang ginagarantiyahan ng Saligang Batas ng Pilipinas, nakapaloob sa Katipunan ng Mga Karapatan or our Bill of Rights under Article 3 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. Hindi dapat magpatibay ng batas na nagbabawas sa kalayaan sa pananalita, pagpapahayag o ng pamahayagan o sa karapatan ng mga taong bayan na mapayapang magkatipon at magpetisyon sa pamahalaan upang ilahad ang kanilang karainan. But of course, we believe that free speech and press freedom should be anchored on correct and verified information. The pandemic, however, has shown us how information is regarded in our country. When our leaders finally accepted that the pandemic was actually a crisis, we found it easy to define the essential services and needs, the essential persons to take charge of the services, the essential agencies responsible to deliver the services. Unfortunately, isa po ang access to information sa mga area o issue na madaling naisantabi. And yes, we would all think that that is strange because it is, especially at this point, that information is most crucial. Mula po noong March 16, ang PCOO or Presidential Communications Operations Office had issued a series of Freedom of Information Advisory that adjusted the allowed period to respond to FOI requests depending on quarantine policies in place. So, yan, depende kung GCQ, ECQ, MECQ. This was, of course, in the context that government agencies were working on skeleton staffing. But admittedly, sa amin po sa media, it made access to information more difficult. It was understandable, but it wasn't clear how government agencies prioritized increasing their capacities to respond to information requests. You would also remember that in the early policies crafted to ensure social distancing, the media was once required to undergo accreditation in order to perform our duties. Kalaunan, hindi rin naman naging practical yung ganong polisiya. Early in May, the Freedom for Media, Freedom for All network reported that from March 23, when the Bayanihan to Heal as One law was enacted, until April 20, at least 60 individuals across the country had been charged by government officials on the basis of the fake news provision of the said law. In the same report from the documentation work done by the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility and the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, there were at least 61 reported incidents of threats and attacks against the press, including 3 journalists who were killed. Mula po yan ng January 1 to 2019 until April 30, 2020. So pasok po doon sa mga unang panahon pa natin under COVID-19. Virtual pressers became a thing. Ulit, sige, intindihin natin, it's because of social distancing, but obviously such practice does not give room to entertain questions. And then, of course, we have the Abs-Cbn shutdown, which clearly limited the access of people to information, especially in some areas, in many areas, where the network is the only accessible channel by which people can get news and updates. At nakalulungkot din po, ito ay isang area na hindi masyadong napapansin, maging ang mga community press po sa mga malalayong probinsya ay kinailangang magsara. According to the Philippine Press Institute, this was in early May and at the height of the lockdown policies. At least half of their members in the community press had to stop printing due to economic and mobility issues. And of course, mainit na issue po ngayon itong Rappler libel case at ang anti-terrorism bill. Now, whether you think Rappler deserves this or not, or we need the anti-terrorism bill or not, all this send a strong and chilling message for us in the media. At naniniwala po kami na ang mga kaganapang ito ay hindi lang makakaapekto sa malayang pamamahayag, kundi sa karapatan ng lahat para sa malayang pagpapahayag. I'm on the third slide, right? Okay. So ano pong itsura ng access to information? Balik po konti, sorry. Yan. In our June 5 report, we shared that the PCOO has so far received 1,332 requests from journalists and the public for COVID-19 related information. More than half of those requests are still being processed, while about a third have been denied supposedly because they were lodged in the wrong agency, or the requester did not provide his or her complete details, or the information is already available online. You can see more of this report from our website. Ito pong nakikita ninyo ngayon, balik po, sorry. Yan, okay. To be fair, frontline agencies provided information on specific COVID-19 programs. Nakapost po yan sa mga website nila. But of course, yung pinopost nila ay depende sa kung anong tingin nilang importanteng impormasyon na ibahagi sa publiko. Now, PCIJ, as part of its FOI advocacy and as part of the Right to Know Right Now coalition, pushed for more transparency on services and programs in response to COVID-19 and carried out this public information request. So overall po, the coalition observed that information is being provided by concerned government agencies, but these are incomplete, sparse, and not in open data format. So this is where we keep track of the information. If you have time, you can visit these links to see the actual tracker, and we produced summary reports. These are also public. You can access them from that link. Last po, Sorry, next slide. Yan. In the midst of this crisis, in the midst of misinformation and disinformation, and sorry po, back po konti, sorry. And in the perspective for a better normal, the people is at the losing end if they are not provided the accurate, relevant, and discerning information. We cannot just allow an environment that pays little regard to access to information. We must always push back, especially if it meant giving our reports and stories more meaning and context and making it more relevant to the lives of the people. I should mention that the media has gone way beyond what is expected of them, just like many other frontliners. Pero, syempre po, hindi kami perpekto at kinikilala namin na marami pang bagay na dapat naming pagkahusayan. We need to move the story forward. We need to work more on data. We need to do the math. Nagsisikap po kami at patuloy na nagtataguyod ng karapatan para sa malayang pamamahayag dahil naniniwala kami na ito ay hindi lamang karapatan ng mga nasa media. We believe that freedom of the press is anchored on the people's right to know. Last na lang po. Last point, sorry. My last point is to remind every journalist to stay safe. I guess that it also is applicable to lahat po ng mga sector na nagsalita din before me. We must stay healthy, physically, emotionally, and mentally. For us in the media, we should do this to live for the next story and for our families also. But also stay safe, not only from COVID, but from all the dangers that we encounter as we perform our duty. Yan lang po. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Simon. And we now turn over the floor to Attorney Emilio Marañon. Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me, Attorney? Yes. Can you hear me, sir? Okay, Attorney Marañon will be starting with his presentation, still regarding human rights, and he is also a political analyst. We are just waiting. I think he's been having some technical difficulty. Can you hear me now, Attorney? All right. Should we just wait for Attorney, or we will turn over to our next speaker? Attorney Marañon. All right. Okay. So we will be going back to Attorney Marañon in a while, but first we will turn you over to our next speaker. Before that, we heard Ms. Simon talking about press freedoms and freedom of the press in the time of COVID. But for now, we will be turning you over to our next topic regarding an inclusive, secure, and peaceful and just better normal with a focus on law enforcement. The next presenter will be Attorney Abdul Jamal Dimaporo. He is currently head of the National Bureau of Investigation in Iligan City. He was former chief of the legal division of the Office on Muslim Affairs of the South Luzon Regional Office. Good afternoon to you, Attorney Dimaporo. You may start your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, medyo nagtataka lang ako, but parang mali yata yung napasukan ko, puro negatives against the government, no? Hindi naman siguro ganon. Nagkataon lang. So, what I'm going to discuss here is the role of the law enforcement, no, during the COVID period, pandemic, no. As we can proudly say, now we are doing our job accordingly. No? As government interagency task force declared enhanced community quarantine, law enforcement officers need to enforce and to respond to calls for service-related public health orders and protocols. There is some apprehensions that enforcement actions could require detention and fines, which could raise additional public safety and civil liberty concerns. Local government officials' understanding of the critical role of law enforcement plays in their community will shape the effectiveness of the local government's plans, to slow down the spread of the COVID-19 virus. The COVID-19 pandemic is a health crisis with serious human and social consequences. It has also created challenges for law enforcement agencies. It invites to reflect on the innovative measures that can arise within the law enforcement works. The government IATF policies related to COVID-19 should be clearly communicated to all local enforcement officers. This information is meant to help local enforcement officers better understand their authority in such situations, along with methods to reduce risk and exposure. Local law enforcement leaders should clearly establish how officers are to interact with the community in enforcing the rules. Officers should be prepared to answer questions about travel restrictions, quarantine and isolations, and personal safety measures, including, the role of the law enforcement should be focused on informing the public about the current restrictions and encouraging individuals to comply with the state and the local emergency health declarations. Our office, the NBI management, ordered all its offices to conduct information drive, seeking the cooperations of the public to report to our offices businessmen who are into overpricing and hoarding, criminal activities and threat, discriminations, or harm on frontliners, and the LGU's corrupt practices, such as no food distributions, quarantine protocol violations, and SAF violations. So we made an information drive to all concerned, para po mag-report ang mga tao kung sino man ang naharas or whoever doing some criminal activities. Our offices implemented those measures. We have made several information drives, entrapment operations on overpricing and investigate LGUs on violations of SAP, yung ayuda. Likewise, other law enforcement unit do the same. Tulad ng mga pulis, sa mga military, sa Bureau of Fire, sa mga Coast Guard, gumagawa rin sila ng kanilang measures. Many cases were filed on various offenses set forth by the IATF. However, because of the new to us, biglaan to, hindi lahat na tao prepared, especially yung mga tao nagmaman sa checkpoint. They are unprepared kasi mabilisan eh. They were being put there, and itong sakit kasi ito is different, We encountered many challenges, yung sa amin sa law enforcement, such as yung accessibility and mobility ng mga tao namin, o yung mga subject o yung individuals na sinusumpina natin para pumunta sa office natin because of the ECQ and boundaries protocols being put by the IATF. Yung mga ibang law enforcement naman natin, nahirapan sila, yung iba sa kanila hindi nila ma-distinguish who are APOR, yung authorized person outside residence, and the civilian passerby. May mga encounter nga kami dyan, naririnig namin sa mga kasama natin na abogado lang, pero pag judge ka, sabi niya, judge ka, you are not a lawyer, parang ganon. Physician and doctor, sabi niya, physician po kayo, hindi kayo doctor. So nagkakaroon ng misunderstanding, miscommunication, or yun ang nagkakaroon ng problema. So kailangan yung training ang mga tao. The law enforcement officer must have clear guidance on the proper procedure regarding the isolations and detentions of infected community members. Law enforcement officers should be provided information about how to detain or isolate a person who is perceived as having an infectious disease, including how to handle situations when a person fails to comply. Policies should clearly stipulate how to handle arrest. Law enforcement may also need to identify location other than the local jail for detentions and isolations of individuals who do not comply with health emergency declarations. As we made arrest, we find difficulties in filing an inquest proceedings because of the skeletal staffing of personnel of some prosecutor's office. The same with the detentions of the arrested individual, as local jail facilities stop accepting prisoners for fear of the virus.
Okay.
We are also, yes, less lang. Local officials should also understand the considerable risk law enforcement officers face in potentially being infected by the COVID-19 virus. Like health practitioners, law enforcement, and other first responder will most likely encounter an infected individual. In addition to potential hazard related to contracting the COVID-19 virus, law enforcement officer could also experience considerable stress during this time, increased pressure, and continued obligations outside of work, along with the potential of family members falling ill, will create stress, fear, and anxiety. The law enforcers are human who experience physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. The government should address this problem by coming up with the long-term solutions to ensure the efficiency of the law enforcer works. Effective partnership with the law enforcement agencies and communities will ensure higher levels of compliance of health protocols.
Okay.
It is critical. Yes, yan ko lang, i-wrap up ko na lang. While implementing the IATF health protocols, a response to the COVID-19 existential threats can require limits to fundamental rights and freedoms. There is a high risk that government will overstep and excessively impede rights and freedom in response to COVID-19. A crisis requires immediate and urgent response. However, any kind of reactions to the crisis must be strictly based on the principles of the rule of law. Measure must respect the principle of legality, legal certainty, and must be constantly re-evaluated. The government shall continuously provide timely information to all concerned to ensure the well-being of everyone. Concerned government agency shall develop its methodologies, tools, and best practices for analyzing and supporting the efficiency and the quality of law enforcement. These tools can be useful in particular in the period of a crisis and during its aftermath. To draw lessons positive and negative as part of its evolution process for the improvement of the public service of law enforcement agencies and to ensure the safety of the citizens. The government shall provide the basis for a possible new roadmap with guidance in period of crisis that impact the public service of law enforcement for a better normal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney Dimaporo, for giving us the side of law enforcement during the time of the pandemic. We'd like to turn you over again to Attorney Emil regarding freedom of speech and of the press for his presentation. Good afternoon to you, Attorney Marañon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Okay. So basically, itutuloy ko lang po yung discussion ni Ma'am Rose at saka ni Ma'am Florine kanina. And yung overall observation natin is that merong departure sa tinatawag na constitutionalism at saka sa rule of law the past 3 months yung na-observe natin, di ba? So people can argue, for example, that in the case of Rappler, dumaan din sa proseso, may dumaan sa due process, nahatulan ng judge. So eventually, parang dumaan din siya sa tinatawag na may semblance of rule of law din. However, we have to realize that the concept of rule of law is rooted on fairness and justice. So pag yung isang bagay, wala nang veers away from these two principles, then it is no longer rule of law, but rather it is the rule of those who wield the law. So these two are starkly different, no? So next slide, please. Ang point dito is that the Constitution and the law should never be used or weaponized to stifle the criticisms and dissent, or to cover government incompetence or inefficiencies, di ba? Bakit? Kasi ang criticism and dissent are assumed risk by anyone who enter or join the government, especially those yung mga tumakbo yung para manalo at maupo sa gobyerno. Kasi in seeking government office, a politician presents himself to the public as capable and competent to govern. So failing to live up to this expectation earns the public the collective right to criticize and dissent the government that has been elected. The rule is very simple, in other words. If you cannot stand criticism, it's either you make yourself better or you get out of it. But you don't make everyone shut up or threaten them to shut up or threaten them to shut up. Diba? So for me, the crisis doesn't suspend the Constitution and its guarantee. So kahit sabihin natin na pandemic tayo ngayon, it doesn't suspend the operation of the Bill of Rights. It doesn't suspend our international commitment sa international law, sa international human rights law. Ang point dito is that dissent and criticism should rather be taken as an opportunity to improve government performance and efficiency in times like this. So in other words, instead na dapat ma-disappoint yung gobyerno or magalit dahil kinikriticize ng taong bayan, what it should do, dapat makinig siya because after all, yung relationship ng gobyerno at saka ng the government and the governed should be collaborative. Ibig sabihin, nakikinig yung bawat isa, di ba? So ang punto dito is that what we need now is solution. Solution po yung hinahanap natin kung paano natin maso-survive yung pandemic until we find a vaccine hopefully in the next 2 years. We need solution and not distraction. So ang dapat gawin ng gobyerno is that ang wine-weaponize dapat yung Constitution not to silence critics, but rather it needs to weaponize law and the Constitution to find solution to different problems. Ano ito? For example, yung ating problema sa healthcare system natin, yung access ng taong bayan at saka yung cost ng healthcare, problema sa pagkain, sa trabaho, transportation, at saka sa mass testing. So in other words, dapat mag-focus ang gobyerno at saka marunong siya mag-prioritize kung ano yung dapat yung importante. So in other words, hindi yung hanapin dapat yung solusyon, hindi lang yung magpakulong ng kung sino-sino dahil hindi ito po ang kailangan natin sa panahong ito. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat po sa inyong presentation, Attorney Marañon. Samantala po, the next part of our program will be from one of our reactors on general insights and analyses that would identify gaps and solutions to peace and justice issues to achieve the better normal. We have with us former Representative Tomasito Villarin. He is a former DILG Undersecretary as well as former representative of the Akbayan Party List in the 17th Congress. He authored the law institutionalizing the 4Ps and the Safe Spaces Act. And he also co-authored the Universal Healthcare Law, the Expanded Maternity Leave Law, and the Free Tertiary Education in Public Schools. He also vetoed the Anti-Contractualization Law, among others. Good afternoon to you and welcome, Congressman Villarin.
Well, good afternoon to all panelists and our attendees to this forum. My presentation would basically just look at how elusive peace and justice is under an authoritarian rule. Well, before the pandemic, next slide, please. Before the pandemic, we have already a crisis, no? Democracy is in crisis in the Philippines, but also globally, the big democracies like Brazil, India, you have Hungary, Turkey, were also under a crisis in democracy. No? Now, in the Philippines, as we all know, there's a lot of human rights violations. Then we also have the muzzling of the press. We have, in a way, the rise of the Marcoses, no? And historical revisionism, and even former President Gloria Arroyo was convicted of charges before, also was back in power. And under this government, corruption has become its own reward. We have appointees in government that were just rehashed, even if there were already corruption issues against them. Now, if we look at the governance mindset under this administration, it's basically a national security mindset, no? Wherein appointments in key cabinet posts are given to former military officials. Then, of course, the martial law in Mindanao, the longest, almost 2 years of martial law, which I have not really achieved in addressing the peace and justice issues of that of Mindanao. Likewise, in terms of our foreign policies, we pivoted to China, and in a way, it also affected our sovereignty, as the UNCLOS ruling in the West Philippine Sea has now been discarded in favor of rapprochement with China. And in terms of our governance policies on how the state is being used, again, there's cronyism is back. The regulatory power are captured by vested interest, and we also saw that in the telecoms industry. Now, next slide, please. If we look at, if we want to know how to respond to this crisis, we must understand what is the nature of this administration that is now governing our country. We have seen Duterte from being a mayor. His template in terms of governance is really a local political system, no? Mastered by warlords and violent clans. No? His approach to politics is a zero-sum game, and no quarters are given to the legitimate political opposition. We have seen how the power of the purse or the budget process, no, has been used, no, as a carrot for legislators to support his administration, while those who oppose his administration are held to court. No? And we have that in the person of Senator De Lima. Of course, we could say that compared to previous authoritarian regimes like Marcos and even Hitler, this authoritarian form of regime under Duterte can be termed as an electoral authoritarian regime or a competitive authoritarian regime, which in a way it still holds multi-party elections, but under a climate of fear and disinformation. So going to the COVID-19, if our democratic institutions are at best frail and dysfunctional, what we have seen right now in terms of its COVID-19 response is a dysfunctional response, because a martial law type or style of governance of this pandemic is not suited. No? And this was in a way unmasked by Dr. Liachon when he said there's no transparency, there's no proper information being given to the public. And the failure to flatten the curve as the post-lockdown positives are increasing shows that, no, that people are not really into it. I mean, they don't understand why we need the lockdowns. And in fact, this lockdown has not really addressed, no, the other concerns from food, from shelter, from having incomes of most people. And of course, we have seen the railroading of the anti-terror bill amid the lockdowns. No? So this is the situation where we are in right now. So what would happen next? No? Next slide, please. Well, the situation right now is similar to 1985, no? When our economy crashed down. No? In fact, economic projections say that the economy will contract by 3.6%. No? Our government debt is rising. In fact, our revenues are down by 88%, and there's high unemployment and poverty. From a 16.6% in poverty incidence, now it is rising to close to 24.3, or a 7% increase. No? Now, how will a government under Duterte respond to this economic contraction and these problems that we are facing? Well, we have seen that the response is really to impose draconian measures in the name of national security. And all that is in anticipation of the next presidential elections. The gambit of President Duterte is to escape accountability. And that can only be done if the next president would be his successor or someone who is close to him. Or the worst scenario will be a revolutionary government or a self-coup that he has been declaring all along. So we don't need this gambit, no? And our way should be to build back better, no? And I think one of the foremost things we have to do is really reviewing our economic policy from being consumption-driven growth. 70% of our GDP is basically consumption, no? And we have to focus more in investing in the real economy. And secondly, we should not leave the poor behind. And we need social protection measures beyond the social amelioration program, but it must be equity and rights-based, universal, and no longer targeted. And also, if we want to invest, no, the focus should be on green infrastructures, focus on health, focus on agro-processing value chain, and alternative transport modalities, especially in urban areas. And also, we need to assert our democratic rights, especially in these times of crisis, in times when our democratic space is shrinking. We should assert our democratic rights. And we should not forget that we demand accountability in governance. We need to demand accountability, how this government has responded. And of course, if we are still a democracy, we should fight against all authoritarian measures. And I think as a people, we can do that. Thank you and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you to you as well, Congressman Tomasito Villarin, former representative of Bayan. And our next reactor will be giving her insights on peace and justice issues in building a better normal, particularly how these pertain to the youth sector. Our reactor, Ms. Regine Rodriguez, is Communications Director of the Office of Congressman Rufus Rodriguez. She is also the chairperson of the Young Centrist Union, a youth political organization espousing centrist principles. She is a fourth-year law student at the University of the Philippines. Let's welcome Ms. Rodriguez. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. First, we would like to thank Greenpeace for providing this platform of learning from our esteemed speakers, including Dr. Romero and my professor, Dean Tony Lavina. In this 5 minutes of my reaction, we will be talking about the key transition changes of the youth and how this is disrupted in this pandemic. The youth sector is one of the most vulnerable sectors of society in this pandemic, as most young people, compared to any other age demographic, are still going through drastic changes in their lives in terms of education and in terms of employment. This makes the pandemic and the uncertainty a little bit more difficult for young people to deal with and to plan for a better normal. The Philippines, compared to our neighboring countries and other countries in the world, is generally a demographically young nation, with 32 million aged 1 to 14 and 19 million aged 15 to 24 years old. This youth sector cannot be merely disregarded in terms of planning for a better normal. For the first prong with regard to this disruption is really purely on education. Access to quality education has been a continuous issue plaguing our country way before the pandemic, let's make that clear, and also a subsidiary issue to social justice. This is much more true now than it was before. Our institutional foundations on education and the systems in which we do this, down to localities and municipalities, are being tested now more than ever. With regard to primary and secondary education, the DepEd, or through Secretary Briones, has already announced a strategy of blended learning or distance learning, wherein it involves radio, television, online, and modular learning. However, President Duterte has also pronounced that we're not very sure if we're ready for this, nor can we afford it. And more than that, teachers are already asking for more time to prepare, showing that the supply side of education is not yet at optimal capacity to allow for this blended learning. More than that, the access to online education is a big problem with regard to more of our rural areas in the Philippines, and even to our urban poor, with regard to providing for gadgets, and not just gadgets, but even for paying for the online services and platforms is another obstacle that the government has yet to address in this pandemic. More than that, with regard to colleges and universities, we're also seeing that online classes have started rolling out as early as March and April. However, the poor internet infrastructure in the Philippines is also working against our young people's access to these materials and to completing their courses. And this is why we are asking, especially from the youth sector, a more holistic approach in terms of providing solutions for the educational system and how we're able to access these materials. Because we want to make sure that no child, regardless of socioeconomic standing, is left behind because of this pandemic. And again, this is not a new issue. However, it is magnified by the pandemic. But more than that, we're seeing some opportunities with regard to the youth sector. And this includes online certificate courses being offered from everywhere. Again, this surfaces the issue of access. With regard to employment, we're, as already thoroughly discussed by one of the speakers, this is a big problem with regard to the pandemic, but more so with the young people. As the newest addition to the labor force, the youth is more vulnerable, as we may be the first ones out of a job with regard to this pandemic. Most of the young people are from entry-level jobs and industries where many young people have the opportunity of employment, like tourism or like restaurants, are being forced out of a job. And we're seeing that, again, this is a trend of not an issue that is not new, as unemployment has been a lingering issue, but again, being magnified. Even with regard to career prospects, many young people are seeing this uncertainty as crippling and providing more anxiety with regard to their day-to-day lives. However, we're also seeing that these things, like the education problem, the employment problem, and more so our poverty problem, has shown an opportunity and silver lining wherein we're seeing more young people speaking out. And this is a new wave of activism that has never been seen before and is stronger than ever before. And we're happy to see these young people and more of these students speak out and talk about the democracy, talk about what's happening around them. And we see this when, especially now, when some of our human and civil rights are being endangered. And this is seen in the anti-terrorism bill, wherein a lot of young people took onto social media platforms with regard to asking their congressmen to vote against it, asking their representatives to review the bill again, and even with the Office of the Second District of Cagayan de Oro, where we voted against the anti-terrorism bill. Even before that, there have been letters being sent in, and most of them coming from young people. This is a silver lining that we're seeing, and we hope to continue in the future. But lastly, I would just like to also zero in on the mental health problem that is also crippling everyone. As I mentioned, anxiety and stress is very high up in exacerbating the mental problems and the mental health problems we're seeing as an institutional failure also of the Philippines. Although we already have a law for mental health, I think the implementation is yet to be seen on the ground. Just to wrap up, as we'll still have a question and answer portion, we're seeing in the youth sector that the pandemic should be seen as an overall health issue, not only physiologically, but also psychologically, especially with young people, and that we must seek a better normal together. Our institutional and systematic shortcomings are being magnified, sadly, and that these problems are not new nor novel, but are aggravated by this pandemic. We call for a holistic and multifaceted youth plan for the pandemic and a new normal to make it better. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation, Regine Rodriguez, representing the youth sector. And for a last speaker, will be presenting an overall synthesis and of the discussions and present insights and analyses on issues our society faces in the quest to build an inclusive, secure, peaceful, and just better normal. Our final speaker, Dr. Tony Lavina, is an educator, lawyer, social entrepreneur, and an environment and human rights advocate. Dr. Lavina is former Dean of the Ateneo School of Government and former Undersecretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. He is a lead negotiator for the Philippines in the international climate change negotiations. Dr. Lavina has published dozens of books, papers, and articles on a range of subjects in law and governance, including in constitutional law, international and Philippine environmental law, indigenous peoples' rights, biodiversity and biotechnology, sustainable agriculture, trade and environment, mining, public ethics, human rights, leadership, local governance, social accountability, and social entrepreneurship. Please welcome Dr. Tony Lavina.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon to everyone. It was fascinating listening to all the resource persons, and I have a very difficult job of trying to summarize all of that in 5 minutes, or 7 minutes to be precise. So I'm actually going to do it not by going through the details of what everyone said, by looking at broad strokes and then identifying the things we have to discuss further, given what the theme is of peace and justice for this roundtable, in identifying the elements of a new normal which would actually have achieve peace and justice. We heard from several of our colleagues both broad strokes, macro insights on the macro situation that is facing the country today in the midst of the pandemic, and actually we often say that what we're facing is a different thing in terms of the pandemic, but based on what I heard from Doy, from Joshua, from Rose, actually, and even from Tom, I mean, from all of you, is that the current situation we are in is not just because of the pandemic, but because of our society. In other words, what we call the normal now, the new normal now, is really the old normal aggravated by a pandemic. Injustice, inequality, failure of our institutions, lack of rule of law, all the tendencies towards oppression and draconian measures, all of that, even without the pandemic, was already happening. The pandemic accelerates that. If there's a trend, it accelerates that, aggravates that. And let's be very clear that that is the case to understand what we are in right now. I mean, and I saw that across all the presentations. Of course, we've also had very interesting micro presentations on education. My student Regine just did that, which can actually give you also a glimmer of hope if you want, and I think I'll talk about that later on. But also the labor sector, as we've seen, the human rights sector in itself, the press. Florine also gave a very good reflection on that, and there you can see that in the sectors, the good thing I think is in the sectors there is ferment. People are disturbed, people are provoked. That what we are experiencing is not the right thing and should not be part of the new normal. I mean, and so I'd like to actually move forward on that. Now, what's the better normal? I think it's the phrase that was used when we were invited to do this. What's the better normal? Well, it's exactly not what it currently is, which is based on what we had before the pandemic hit us. And so our focus should be on what changes need to happen as we move forward, what changes need to happen so that the past is not repeated, and that we're able to move forward. And then our speakers actually were able to identify some of that. I mean, I think Doi on the broader political frame. I think Tom also on the broader political frame. I mean, how we must really work hard to change our political system. I mean, if you are not to go back to even what was to if we're not to, I don't say go back because that's where we are still. If we don't want to aggravate even further our political situation, we have to address economic inequality, and here many opportunities to do that. I think a couple of times transportation was mentioned. The pandemic gives us a chance to have a long-term solution for our transportation system. The situation of sectors like women. I think there is an opportunity also to do that, and the youth above all. I mean, and I like it that Regine was the last speaker, because we do have a real chance to fix the educational system now. From what it was, it wasn't good before this, and of course, if we botch this, if we bungle this, it will get worse. I mean, where the poor particularly will lose their chance to be educated. But we have to we have the chance now to actually fix that, if you identify what needs to be done at the educational level. I mean, and just to let you know, in my case, for example, I actually teach now in 12 universities, in a dozen universities, and completely retooling myself to maximize the opportunities that this drastic situation, the pandemic, has done us. I think I go back to the beginning of YEB, to people that have listened to me when I talk about the environment. This is the best chance we ever have of fixing or of solving our big environmental problems: climate change, biodiversity extinction, plastic pollution. In the old normal and in the aggravated normal, which we now have, there was no chance to solve that. No chance at all to solve that. But here, we have a potential reset, which if we work hard enough, I think we can then create that better normal. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Tony Lavina, for your overall synthesis on the various points discussed in today's roundtable discussion. I just like to ask a question to Attorney Algamar Latip. You've mentioned a while ago the Marawi siege. No? Of course, you've mentioned the historical perspective of the Bangsamoro struggle. But particularly the Marawi siege and extremism. Moving forward, what are your recommendations for a better normal for people in Marawi and also for the Bangsamoro as a whole with regard to extremism? Attorney Latif?
Okay. Palagi kasi ang option ay yung coercive power ng government, which is the military and the police. This has to be changed. You have to strengthen the institution, government's institution, the accountability mechanism. Like, for instance, we have to start with the electoral process. It must be credible that it is reflective of the people's will. We have to include the people in the political participation, kasi kung hindi sila nakakapag-participate at hindi sila kasama sa discourse, walang spaces sila. Saan space sila pupunta? Violent extremism is a political activity. It is illegal. So when there is no space for them, And when the institution of government, delivery of basic services ay wala sa grounds, saan sila pupunta? So yung mga bata, nagkakaroon sila ng grievance sa government to do that particular aspect of hindi maganda, no? So it is you provide a law, you change the approach from the coercive military using violence, because the government has the monopoly of using legitimate violence against its people, like this, na maging proactive, tignan kung ano yung mga accountability mechanism na nakaset up sa batas at strengthen ito. Strengthen mo yung law enforcement, strengthen mo yung judiciary, yung mga courts para hindi magre-redo yung mga tao, family feud, para doon na lang sila sa korte pumunta. Strengthen mo yung Office of the Ombudsman para kasuhan at ipakulong yung mga taong nagkasala sa gobyerno, yung mga kurakot. And then, I think, strengthen mo yung gobyerno, yung institution ng gobyerno, yun ang solusyon na nakikita ko. In times of pandemic na ganito, merong limitation of freedom of movement ng mga tao. Yung sa Bangsamoro ay matindi yung implication sa economic kasi sila na pinakamahirap sa Bangsamoro. And then you have this limitation of freedom of movement and the pandemic, walang internet, walang digitization. Napakalaki yung impact sa kanila. So yun yung nakikita kong mga options na dapat gawin.
All right. Thank you po sa insight ninyo, Attorney. And as a wrap-up, we'd like to get a statement from all of our speakers. One very quick and short insight on para sa inyo po, ano po yung better normal sa konteksto ng peace and justice? We'd like to start with Dr. Doy Romero. Dr. Romero?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Parting shot po, sir.
Yes. The emphasis is on people taking care of themselves, not only in the basic necessities, but also in their civil and political rights. They cannot just watch idly by as these rights are being robbed of them. So they have to participate.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Romero. And next to speak is Ms. Rosemary Tejano. Very quickly, what for you is a better normal in the context of peace and justice? Okay, from Ms. Rose, we'll move on to Attorney Latif again for his parting words regarding what is the better normal for him in the context of peace and justice. Attorney.
In the context of Bangsamoro, sana yung approach ay contextual din doon sa kanilang context para at least mas responsive yung mga solusyon kung ano man yung dapat na gawin natin.
Okay, thank you so much, Attorney. And next is Mr. Joshua Mata.
I'd like to echo what everyone is saying. We need a society where people's participation in shaping our society is actually institutionalized. That's the only way we can build a truly just and lasting and resilient society.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mata. And next is Attorney Virginia Suarez.
Hello, everyone. Peace and justice is impossible without economic development. And this is the time where, yes, as Attorney Lavina said, it's time for us to reset. No, it's time for us to build our own industry and not to depend on import products. It's time for us now to improve our land, our own natural resources, claim and make use of our natural resources. It's about time not to use our natural resources for our own good, for our own local consumption, and not for import, and never for foreign use and for capital use or for profit. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And next is Ms. Florine Simon.
In the context of peace and justice, and in the context, of course, of press freedom and freedom of speech, a better normal is where everyone is not afraid to speak. to talk about injustice, to exact accountability from those who promise to serve us.
Thank you so much. And next is Attorney Emilio Marañon III.
Yeah, for me, the better normal if kung magsimula na uli magbasa ng konstitusyon yung ating gobyerno at saka yung ating mga decision makers. Because basically, the past 3 months, what they did is to deviate from the basic intent of the Constitution. And that's the reason why we have so many problems. Ang dami nating complications, ang daming mali, because simply of that. So, well, hopefully, magbasa uli sila ng Constitution and go back to the basics of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And next is Attorney Abdul Jamal Dimaporo. Attorney Dimaporo.
Yes, good afternoon. Siguro, no, we have to build trust and confidence sa government natin and try to understand and cooperate with what policies are being made by the government. Kasi pag wala yun, medyo magkakaroon ng problema. So, pasensya lang po.
Yes, hello?
Hello.
Oh, yes, sir, you have a bad signal?
Yes.
All right.
What I'm saying is
that
that,
was...
hello?
Yes, sir. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes. Yes, the citizen must be understanding and cooperate what the government no, at maging patient tayo at magtiwala tayo sa gobyerno natin because the government is doing what is best for the people. Salamat po.
Maraming salamat din po sa inyo. And we have next former Congressman Tomasito Villarin. Sir?
Yes, I think building back better normal would mean that we have to fight fear and disinformation with truth. No, we need to organize to empower people and communities, and that what we need now are bottom-up solutions, no, not top-down solutions, and that would entail, like for the economy, we should promote a solidarity economy rather than a consumption-driven economy. And politically, respect for human rights is what we need now.
Okay, thank you, sir. And next is Miss Regine Rodriguez.
Yeah, I think a better normal, especially for the youth, is when the young people can actually continue to pressure decision makers and policy makers to improve our institutions, whether that's through engaging them or going to the ballot in 2022.
Thank you. And Dean Tony Lavina for your closing remarks.
Yes, I actually wanted to go back also to the Bangsamoro because that's very important. I didn't mention it in my summary, because where the Bangsamoro goes the Philippines in my view. I mean, so what I would like to see is a peaceful Philippines where no one is left behind. Kaya, and I'm always asked. I always say, for me, 3 things. Inequality, an unequal society will never be a good society. And then, just society, kasama na dyan yung rule of law, kasama na dyan yung human rights, kasama na dyan environmental and climate justice, because without justice, you will not be able to have a good society. And then a sustainable society is very important. A sustainable economy is very important because I think in the end of all of this, what's a better normal for me? It's a happy society. Yung talang real happiness where nobody is excluded. I mean, that's where we are. And I go back to what I said. I think we actually have a real chance now. Without the pandemic, I would have said parang give up na siguro ako. Parang, well, for this generation. And hindi naman ako, I would have just the truth is that parang gusto ko na magturo na lang. Bahala na ang next generation. That's why I'm teaching. Every semester, I have 500 students from all over the Philippines. Semester yan, talagang, because I'm just investing on that, di ba? But now, with this pandemic, we have a chance. We have a chance, no? To fix it and to do this right. Kasi maraming opportunity for really radical shifts. Because we need a revolution. I mean, a real revolution in many aspects of the way we organize our society.
Thank you so much, Dean Lavina. And for our closing remarks, we'd like to call on the legal advisor of Climate Justice and Liability Campaign of Greenpeace Southeast Asia Philippines, Attorney Hasmina Pauda.
Maraming salamat, Miss Cathy. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pagdalo sa dialogong ito, sa aming mga panelists, sa mga tumutok sa ating social media. Maraming salamat. As we are currently navigating from the seeming confusing implementation of quarantine guidelines due to a little virus where most of the population are advised to stay home, the ongoing response to flatten the curve of the pandemic has brought to fore, as we've seen and heard in the discussion, crucial issues relative to peace and social justice. Sana po sa konversasyong ating natunghayan, nakapagbigay po kami ng kaunting kaalaman, lalo na sa mga pangyayari on the ground at mga posibleng solusyon. Ito po ay kontinusyon ng ating pag-uusap ukol sa paglatag ng mga issue na kailangan nating bantayan at tugunan. Ang gobyernong ito ay may responsibilidad, malaking responsibilidad, kaya din tayong mga mamamayan. Kundi po tayong magsasalita at tumulong sa pag-iisip ng magagandang polisiya gaya ng ating nagawa ngayon, ang mga issue nito ay maaaring hindi matugunan. We need better governance for us to build a better future and of course, a better normal. As we move forward, what we expect and need to hear are progress reports, further actions in combating the crisis, concrete and strategic plans and contingency measures after the lockdown, and words of assurance that will be taken care of by our government. And of course, no one will be left behind. Ipagpatuloy po natin ang diskusyong ito sa susunod nating talakayan. Umaasa kami na magkakaroon ng mas malawak na dialogo kasama ang ating mga policymakers at iba pang stakeholders. Kami po sa Greenpeace ay naglalayon na makamit ang justice, not just Tiis. Building an inclusive, secure, peaceful, and just better normal. Muli, maraming salamat po sa aming magagaling na mga panelists, sa ating audience, at sa ating moderator host, si Ms. Cathy San Gabriel.
Maraming salamat din po sa inyo, Attorney Hasmina. At bago po tayo magpaalam, we'd like to request all our guests and panelists to please face your camera for a group photo. Okay, if we're ready, everyone. Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right. At gaya nga po ng nasabi ng ating mga panelists at especially what struck me was Dean Tony Lavina's words. No, he said this can be a potential reset button. So I hope that we all use it well. At sana nga po sa pagsulong nating lahat patungo sa tinatawag na better normal mula dito sa pandemyang ating kinasasadlakan ay walang maiwan at naway makasama dito ang pagkakaroon ng hustisya, seguridad at kapayapaan. Para po sa ating naging panel discussion ngayon na justice, not just Tiis, building an inclusive, secure, peaceful, and just better normal. Maraming salamat po. Ako po, si Cathy San Gabriel.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po sa inyo. I think
Thanks,
we are
everyone.
not already.
Bye.